生活と歴史の中から、非常に興味深い、話が伝わっています。それはアイヌ・ラックルデンという一つの神話を集めた本の中でも紹介されてますけれども、簡単に木と火の物語をちょっと紹介したいなと思いました。でその中で、人間が生まれる創世記の話の中で火と、木がつながった物語があります。
Listening to the wonderful presentation this morning, it reminds me the stories I'm familiar in Hokkaido, the stories of Ainu people, the indigenous people in Hokkaido, and I'd like to present just one story, ancient story called Ainu Lakru mythology.
天上にいる神々たちは新しい国を作るためにまず最初に一本の木を地上に下ろしました。
So this is a story of Genesis that the first thing that the divinity decided to give on the earth was one tree.
新しい場所に下ろされた木々は別な世界の生活の中でのびのびと豊かにそして楽しくきっと生活したんだろうと思います。
So that the very first tree, we imagine that rooted on the brand new world, and the tree had a very happy life.
でそののびのびと嬉しそうに振る舞う一本の木がいつの間にか美しい一人の乙女に変わっていく姿を天上の神々が驚きながら見ていたんだそうです。
So the tree was so happy to live there. Some time later, it became a very beautiful lady, a girl. And the whole divinity up on the sky was so surprised to see that very first tree transformed to the first woman.
で、その美しく楽しみに振る舞っている、あるいは踊っている一人のお姫様を天上界のイカツカムイという雷神が一目惚れをしました。
Among that deity on the sky, there was one god of the god of thunder, and the name is Ikatsuchi. And the Ikatsuchi, the thunder god, fall in love with the woman, tree woman.
で、そういうようにイカツカムイが、美しい姫に恋焦がれてついつい、自分が神であることを忘れて地上に降りてしまった、あるいは落ちてしまった、落雷してしまったというふうに世界が変わっていく物語に展開していきます。
So he was so in love with her, so he fell in love and he fallen himself, forgetting that he was deity. So he fallen on the tree and it made fire.
それはハルニレという一本の木でしたけれども、その楽しげに地上の世界で振る舞っていた一本の木の神様が美しい乙女になって変容する、それに恋焦がれた雷神がついつい神であることを忘れて地上に落ちてしまった、落雷してしまった。そしてその一本のハルニレと名付けられた木にぶつかって落雷して木は 燃え尽きてしまった。
So the name of the tree is Harunire, and actually I think it corresponds the oak tree. So that beautiful oak tree burned by the thunder.
そのハルニレ、チキサニっていう名前のハルニレの姫様が、その樹木に変容していったわけですけれども、それが1週間燃え尽きてしまって、1週間かかって燃えて、そして燃え尽きてしまった。でそこから、一人の子供が生まれたという神話が、創世記の話の始まりにあります。
So the oak tree was burning for 1 week, and it all totally burned down. But from the black bark, the very first baby was.
I don't think they've turned it on yet. But I think. No, good on you. Yeah. You can hear it there, Tony? Okay. I'm very, very happy that you suggested it. Your idea. Tell me when you want. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Yep. Okay. Yeah, that's true. We love each other so deeply. That I ask you, the sweetheart, why should we quarrel ever? Why can't we be enough clever? Never to part. Every time I say goodbye.
meters on my desk and see if I'm getting 2 channels of audio here. I think I might be on the wrong layer. So I'm on the vocal layer, aren't I? Yeah, am I? Yep. Getting both, yeah. You're saying what? You are, yeah. So can you go on the buttons that select the channels on the left? Can you select the 13 through 24? Yep, yeah, 24. Yeah.
Beautiful. Yeah. You got a good ear. You heard it from up there, did you? Good on you. Thank you. That sounds pretty good at that. I thought it'd be great because the last work I'm talking about. The last work I'm talking about is and so I thought that no, I won't want people walking, then I'll do my talk if there's enough time. Because my last talk is about that. I might just say if there's enough time on my days. Okay. Yeah, I'll put my thing on and start playing. Okay. So Tanya, so it's 10 minutes, it's 10 minutes from when people start walking in, isn't it? I should probably go to about 2:40 because I finish at, no, 2:30. So 2:30, so 2:35, 2:40? Okay. Yeah, I will, yep. Yep.
Thank you, Domenico. So we've just been given a real treat there, I think. A performance from Domenico Di Clario in an amazing way, really, to come back after a really intense morning, I guess, of some really powerful presentations, but I think a great way to ease back into the afternoon of presentations by the fabulous artists we have here. Domenico gave us what I can only describe as an absolute treat on the first Monday evening of Floating Land, where he played at Boring Point as the full moon rose across Lake Catharaba in the background, and we can see an image of that just here. And he'll be doing the same thing, or a similar thing, I should say, down at Little Cove on the very last evening of Floating Land. I think Domenico's work in this iteration of Floating Land, for me, kind of bookend the whole event and ushers in the projects and ushers out Floating Land in a peaceful way rather than a big, fireworks and loud crashing bands sort of way. So, and I think that really echoes my understanding of the thoughtfulness of Floating Land and its history. I'm going to invite Domenico to come up to the lectern and tell us a little bit more about his practice. Thank you, Domenico.
I'm glad you're all here. I didn't think anyone would come in. So quiet. So it's always pretty strange to hear your thoughts being projected out loud to a group of people when really the process of making work or of just simply being is very internal. So I hope you don't get bored. I hope you stay with it. I'm going to try and talk a little bit about the relationship between my practice, which is what I was invited to do. I'd rather sit there and play, though, much longer, which is what I was invited to do, the relationship between my practice and moon cycles. But first I want to pay my respects to the Kabi Kabi people for their custodianship of the land we meet on, and I note they never ceded their sovereignty. I acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging and their timeless connection to land and country. I thank Lyndon, Auntie Helena and Jason for their welcome. I want to thank Michael for inviting me to participate in this project and for giving me the opportunity to share with you all both my approach to being and the thoughts and the commitments that have shaped it. And then I want to express my thanks and gratitude to all those who've taught me, offered me insights and deeply moved me over the years. Most of my teachers have not been artists, and I've learned my most lasting lessons from either my children or from individuals whose lives are very, very different from mine. Whatever I share with you today is simply the crop I'm able to harvest on this occasion from this rich gathering of wisdom and insights and unexpected, gorgeous nothings that I've received from others. And that's the term the poet Emily Dickinson uses to describe the mostly unnoticed gems that offer themselves along all of our paths, whether they're acknowledged by us or otherwise. Since I've been here, I've learned a tremendous amount about the history of this place, the history of First Nations people, and of course I've been able to reflect on my own history. So I thank Jandamara and Leah and Bianca for their offerings, for their contributions to shaping me in real time. How do I describe, though, in 30 minutes or whatever I've got, all of the complexities that have shaped my relationship to the moon and have defined about 150 of my projects. Thanks, Paul, but not yet. I'll start with some context. Not too much, just a little bit. Then I'll briefly describe how this relationship manifested in my work, and then including my performance here, and then give you some descriptions of 3 projects. In the meantime, all of this will go on. It won't be coherently connected, but I'm hoping that you will be able to put together a kind of sense of what I've been involved with. All of the images you'll see are images from projects that have involved moon cycles. So they're all relevant to what I've been asked to talk about. But I won't go into a description of each of them. There wouldn't be enough time. Yeah. Behind me is the very first moon cycle aligned project, working with the tides on Cape Patterson in Victoria, and I'll describe that a little bit later. Context in terms of the moon and its effect on me. So I was told by my parents when I was fairly young that I was both conceived and I was born on a full moon. And I won't give you the details, although I have got them imprinted in my mind and in my soul. Very beautiful, but very descriptive. And this knowledge, this sense of myself has accompanied me and determined to a very high degree my relationship with the night sky. So this first image, I was then an architecture student at Melbourne University, and I used to spend my summers camping at Cape Patterson near Wonthaggi in Victoria, and on each occasion for an entire moon cycle. I'd spend each day gathering found materials along the tide line. This is 1966, you can probably work out how old I am by that. I would spend each day gathering materials found along the tide line and setting up structures that were connected via tautly tied string, holding the thing together in a very, very fragile way. And they'd be washed away by the tides, and as the tides reversed their cycle, I would stand the objects up where I'd find them and tie them up again, and the thing would repeat itself over this 28-day cycle. I was hoping to include the natural dynamics shaping the phenomenological world that I was immersed in a kind of game, a game that visibilised invisible effect of the moon on ocean tides and manifested as a kind of dance of these materials along the shoreline of what was then a deserted beach. As the cycle came to an end, it was exhilarating for me to believe I'd been collaborating for a month with the shining being up in the sky, building together a kind of primitive diagram of its effect on us all down here. And I repeated this process over subsequent years in a number of different contexts. And you can probably let it go now, Paul. Thanks. Inevitably, though, through my deepening connection and fascination with these relationships, there was an intensifying clash during the late 70s and 80s with the values of the art world. And over the next 20 years, I gradually came to experience a sense of disempowerment and directionless, leading me to deeply question the value of the foundation of my practice. In other words, what the fuck was I doing? And its relationship both to the mainstream as well as to my teaching. In June 1987, I turned 40. This significant signpost of a lived life coincided with a deep existential crisis I was experiencing regarding all the roles I was attempting to fulfill, and probably all very badly. That of the artist, the academic, the father, the partner, the son. The gallery's repositioning into the commercial marketplace was by then at its apogee, in part as a reaction to the social upheavals of the 60s and the 70s. From my perspective, as an artist primarily interested in the connection between life and art manifested through a multidisciplinary practice and articulated through site-specific installations and performances, the 80s were marked by a despondent crisis of confidence in the value of ideas, as opposed to a reaffirmation of the art object. Invisible substance once again was being overwhelmed by visible illusion. This conflict deeply confused my relationship with what I thought might possibly lead to a practice such as mine, and I deeply felt I needed to address its paralysing effect on me. So, I decided that in order to celebrate my 40th birthday as a possible rite of passage into a broader understanding, I would spend a couple of weeks somewhere alone, preferably surrounded by a large body of water. Why did I decide this? I'm not sure, but I felt a deep desire to manifest myself as a quasi-shipwreck. In other words, try and find a way to rescue myself from this mire, taking myself far away from the known. So at the local travel agency, I found a cheap deal to a remote little island in the Indian Ocean. Food would be delivered there every 2 days, otherwise solitude would be guaranteed over the 14 days of my residence on the island. I brought just 2 books with me, and to this day they remain sort of the cornerstones of my approach to everything. D.T. Suzuki's Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, and Ramana Maharshi's The Master Speaks. I timed my arrival on the tiny island to coincide with the appearance of the full moon in the dusk sky. At the end of the 2 weeks, I'd reached a conclusion that still largely holds to this day. And this is it. The world was overrun with an overabundance of objects made anecdotally as cultural effigies and images. And rather than add more to the endless pile, the time had come for me to simply re-engage with what was already here, affirming in this way the belief that what was needed for me to be able to offer a sense of value through my practice was already in the world and didn't need to be remanifested or reinvented by me in any way. It seemed to me that rather than to search for the miraculous breach in the continuum, my most valuable contribution as an artist might be to serve the broadest possible community by affirming the most significant ideas that had already been manifested by others. I believe that to do it otherwise would inevitably lead me to repeat or to mouth the same words as many others. So as a long-time soccer player, and please forgive this little anecdote, I can reveal the cynicism with which this attempt to search for the miraculous is viewed by practitioners of that sport. So when you attempt the impossible through pass at the cost of the team's balance, your teammates will look at you with contempt and silently, maybe not so silently, mouth, "That's a fucking Maradona pass." So implying that only the great man could pull off the seemingly impossible, and only an overblown ego like yours would attempt to beat such impossible odds, instead of making the patient, safer, shorter pass that would serve a team's purpose far more efficiently. So this is how it felt to me. And yes, I can enthusiastically admit that a committed sporting life has taught me far more about how to approach a creative life than any artist or any particular pedagogy. I consequently turned to the ideas and practices of Franz Kafka, James Joyce. This is a lengthy list which I've been adding to over the last 12 hours. Anna Akhmatova, Raymond Carver, Jorge Luis Borges, Emily Dickinson, Lucy Irigaray, Eugenia Montale, Georgia O'Keeffe, Jiddu Krishnamurti, Tananarive Dewey, John Cage, Giorgio Morandi, Susie Gablick, Helen Sissou, Italo Calvino, Hazrat Inayat Khan, Toni Morrison, Pablo Neruda, Mevlada, Rumi, Octavia Butler, Giorgio Morandi. Only a few of those are, of course, artists. Perhaps only 3 might be considered as such, though to my mind, both their principal value and that the other luminaries I've mentioned manifest is as pattern breakers. And consequently, my most valuable contribution would be to commit myself to the support of such revolutionaries. I resolved that my approach would transcend culture, generation, and gender, the essentially invisible and universal qualities of light and sound, expressed through the colour spectrum and the chord, organised in space, would be the primary tools I would employ to manifest the ideas of those enlightened enough to have broken through the veil that separates the illusory world of appearance from the invisible world of substance. I immediately began to define my practice through the use of the coloured light spectrum, connecting in this way light to sound, expressing itself as a system of gears, not unlike the way light and sound increases both the quality and the intensity of its output as it manifests vertically upwards through the spine via the 7 principal energy centres of the body known as the chakras. I realised that in the end, what really interested me was architecture, and principally the architecture of the body, manifesting through the chakras, similarly existing in all consciously organised structures inherent in texts, ideas, sound, social systems, literary practice, lifestyle, spatial practices, correspondences between individuals and between communities, all ultimately impacted upon by the outcomes of the exquisite dance that's taken place between sun, moon and earth for over 4 billion years, a dance that's always been manifested and experienced most potently under moonlight. I had a particular interest then in the thoughts and writings of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, and particularly in their proposition of how a major language, which is a global culture, is constructed via the direct effect of a number of minor literatures, which are individual voices and those of minorities, upon its seeming hegemony. So Giorgio Agamben's seminal book, The Coming of a New Community, is also contributed enormously to my conviction. So at the end of my stay on the island, I consequently came to believe that my most effective contribution to my community and beyond would be as a minor literature, working proactively to destabilise an inherent cultural hegemony. I also came to believe that I might achieve this most effectively by supporting other minor literatures as committedly as I could. I left the island on the evening of the autumn equinox of September 22, 1987. As we cleared the mooring, the elderly boatman that was to take me back to Mayafushi pointed up to the sky and asked me to bow respectfully to the new moon that had suddenly appeared in the greenish sky. And this I did. So now I'll describe 3 projects to you, probably the only 3 that are sort of relevant at this point in time. I'll begin with the most recent, which really combines 2 projects. Tonglen, which took place in a garden in Irimpol near Mildura from 2016 until 2018, and Beyond Tonglen, which took place in the same garden and was presented only last month at the Mars Gallery in Melbourne. The following is part of the text that accompanied that exhibition and clarifies the relationship between the 2. It's a text, so please forgive the fact that it's a little formal. In 2015, Ross Lake and Helen Vivian began transforming an 8-acre abandoned vineyard at the back of their property in Irimpol, near Mildura, into a fully reticulated native garden containing hundreds of species of native grasses, shrubs and trees. Its purpose was to create a habitat for native flora and fauna and as a nurturing refuge for humans, to acknowledge how the land might have thrived long ago, to make something of beauty with love and care and effort, and to inspire anyone that might wander by. So Helen's description of the garden is this: following the Japanese principle of borrowed landscape, the Sky Garden is a layered response to the surrounding cultural and physical landscape, drawing inspiration from the Central Australian rippling sandhills, the Murray Sunset National Park, and the immediate, mainly Italian, horticultural environs. There's an endangered woodland community component of this garden as well that's been replanted. This connects with the fact that I moved from Melbourne to Mildura in early 2015, seeking to experience the vastness of the continent that extends from the banks of the Murray deep into its desert interior, and the complexity of its cultural layering from time immemorial to the present day. I was terrified, of course, by the move, And I can explain it as when I arrived in Australia at the age of 9, every time I saw a eucalypt, I would begin to cry. So that was my response to the incredibly sort of seismic shift in experiencing the natural environment from the fauna and the flora of where I'd come from, which is northeastern Italy, to Australia. So a brief parenthesis. This describes a walk, and you can go. Thanks, Paul. Driven by the same urge during 2015, which is to try and understand where I'd ended up with my parents at the age of 9, I undertook a walk from the source of the Murray River, just below Mount Kosciuszko in New South Wales, all the way to its mouth in Goolwa, near Adelaide. The walk was undertaken with permission of the elders of all the nations along the river, from source to mouth. The walk began on a new moon of September 13, 2015, and ended on a new moon of January 10, 2016. Through this time, I was accompanied by the artist Steve Rawle, appearing in various images behind me. The project was funded by the Australia Council, was part of the Mildura Palimpsest Biennale of that year. I lived in the walking slowly downhill, the title of the project, caravan, as you can see, and Steve lived in the van. The caravan became the repository both of the diary I kept and the gorgeous nothings I came across along the way. Why did I undertake this walk? Because I consider myself both a stranger and a beginner, having arrived in Australia in 1956 as a 9-year-old, and I wanted to finally introduce myself to the land that had hosted me since my arrival. What is a stranger, though? Beyond Albert Camus' interpretation of his character Meursault in The Outsider, of being emotionally detached from whatever unfolds, yet still firmly belonging to his contextual Algerian culture, to my mind, the stranger lives both an unbelonging and an unbelonged life, as one who's perennially unhinged from one's core, the core from which one's cultural connectedness both manifests and is experienced, and whose roots can be traced back for at least a few generations. The unhinging of a stranger from his or her original earth can neither be undone nor effectively rehinged, and only rarely might a successful transplantation into new soil be achieved. Consequently, the stranger, for the overwhelming majority of his or her life, lives virtually inside a space that can only sustain a single being. And what is a beginner? To my mind, a beginner doesn't regard knowledge accrued through previous experiences as being useful at all when facing whatever unfolds in the now. The beginner regards such knowledge as a distinct disadvantage because knowing seeks only to confirm recognition in whatever flows from the now. On the other hand, a simple acceptance of one's ignorance can facilitate an experience of this flow as it is, not for how it might reiterate what one imagines one already knows. The simple acceptance can encourage a beginner to embrace whatever is unfolding in the now as authentically as possible. So back to Tonglen, and these are images still of the walk, and they'll go on for a while until there's a video at the end that describes the project I'm talking about. Back to Tonglen. The burial of various objects in the soil of the country I'd migrated to as a child has been an aspect of my practice since the mid-70s, when I began to include such processes in my contributions to both the Mildura Sculpture Triennials and the Mildura Sculpturescapes in the 70s, as well as to other site-specific installations and performances. Part of the reason for my move to the country's interior had been motivated by my search for a burial site that would finally accommodate the vast majority of my possessions, including an archive composed of many of the components I had included in various installations since the 70s, and those of my family. My parents had recently passed away, and I had, of course, had to go through all of their belongings, and this is something I really wanted to keep together as one body. When Ross and Helen generously offered me a corner of their sky garden in 2015, soon after I'd completed my walk along the Murray, I believed I'd found the ideal context for the burial. The archive was shipped from Melbourne and various other storage facilities into a large hay shed 50 metres from the proposed location of the pit. Had to get approval from the Mildura Council and the EPA, but we got that. At dawn, on the conjunction of the full moon and the autumn equinox of 21 March 2016, I carefully placed the first of many thousands of objects, including furniture, books and magazines, paintings and other artwork, clothing, industrial components, 2 automobiles and a trailer, children's toys and various other domestic detritus on the red soil floor of the pit. This ritual continued until its completion at sunset on the autumn equinox of 21 March 2018. It had been regularly solemnised through improvised collaborative performances with Tony Yap, Ren Walters, Carmen Chan and other musicians and performers, regularly at each equinox and solstice and full moon. Once the last item was placed inside the pit, the body of the objects were covered by the soil that had been removed to create its void. A mound rising 2 metres above the surrounding garden was formed, and on its surface 7 trees were planted. Each tree is distinguished by the colour of its seasonal blooms, destined to regularly reproduce a colour spectrum. This flowering signals that the life of the invisible body, made up of the multitude of objects that have been laid to rest below the surface, is ongoing and evolving. The invisible body nurtures visible life, manifesting its collective energies flowing from below the earth and emanating both into the day and night sky. Tonglen, in case you're interested about the title, is a Tibetan Buddhist term that describes the meditative cyclic breathing in of distress, both singular and collective, and the consequent breathing out of ease, as trees and shrubs growing on the mound and through the entire garden breathe in carbon dioxide transmuted through photosynthesis and consequently breathe out life-affirming oxygen. Paul, whenever you get to the video, you can just play it. It's of plein air, blindfolded paintings made in the vastness of the Sky Garden. The 30-day painting journey through the garden began at the precise moment the full moon reached its cyclic apogee at 12:38 p.m. on the afternoon of 17 July 2019. The making of a blindfolded painting began 1 hour later on each subsequent day through the 28 days. So 1:38 the next day, 2:38 p.m. the following day, etc. The journey ended at 5:38 p.m. on the full moon of 15 August, again at the precise moment of the moon's apogee. Each painting was made at specific intervals located along an elongated figure of 8, following the network of gravel paths winding through and around the garden. The figure of 8 both begins and ends at the Tonglen burial site, which is located in the southwestern corner. The paintings were made on small squares of woven carpet. The weave of the carpet felt and looked to me like mallee earth, both in full light of the sun and in the shadows of evening, sustaining the pigment placed and smeared on its surface during the making of the painting. Much like trees, shrubs and clouds stand and float above the surface of the earth. The carpet reminded me of many other things, of my own footsteps, whose crunching sounds I hear as I make my way through the garden, of the encounter between the domestic space I carry with me and the wildness of the native garden, of the magic qualities that in some cultures carpets have long been associated with, and of the carpet in my parents' living room that I crossed numberless times over several decades in both anxiety and in joy. Beyond such impressions and memories, the carpet is constructed through a process of weaving, intermingling, mixing, confusing even, perhaps even alchemically transmuting. And the carpet serves us, softening, sustaining, recording, nurturing, reminding, containing. The paintings are not representations of the visible world, but simply energetic expressions of a moment in time. As once blindfolded, I gradually become immersed in the phenomenological world around me. I feel most comfortable touching the surface of the carpet with my brush while blindfolded than if I'd been working on a stretched canvas visible before me. Why is this? I'm not interested in depicting the world around me in an objective way because I'm convinced that such a world, the world whose characteristics we all broadly agree on, doesn't exist, or exists only in an illusory sense. I believe that there might be another reading of the world that doesn't correspond to the one we think we're seeing. So I sit blindfolded inside the garden, functioning as a consciousness antenna that both receives and transmits a body of information it cannot decipher, yet firmly believes is constantly swirling all around it. The moon cycle plays an important role in mediating this information through the endless impact it has on the Earth's climate, tides, and collective consciousness. This moon-mediated information that floods me as I sit seems immensely complex. The feel of the wind on my face, the sounds of trickling water, distant traffic, chattering night birds and other animals, the penetrating cold seeping through my clothes, the incessant sound of starlight, the oxygen-rich night air flooding my lungs, the occasional falling of rain on my hands and cheeks, and of course the constant presence of my own particular anxiety, which is very constant. The desire to journey through the garden blindfolded and return with some evidence of my experience comes from a wish to personally introduce the collective energy of the burial site, steeped in my own and my family's belongings, to the rest of the growing garden as it thrives intensely with native plants and trees and birds. That garden knows little of the energetic narratives that wind themselves around the myriad objects under the mounded earth. From there they nightly emanate into the land, far beyond the garden itself, and as they do, they confound themselves in the living land because the stories they tell each other are so different in language and context and content. I've come to believe that the entire garden is a burial mound, whose surface covers a body which includes numberless collections of sacred objects, bones, clothing fragments, implements and tools, body decorations and so on, all manifesting as living trees, shrubs and grasses above it. I consider that my most useful function might not be as an artefact maker, but as the blurrer of lines, as the link between one kind of recent burial site and an endless other whose contents might date back 60,000 years or more. I hope that my presence in the garden through a whole lunar cycle from full moon to full moon might soften the boundaries that exist between what lies under the entire surface of the garden surface, indeed under the entire surface of the land, and what lies beneath the mound. In that sense, I don't actually do, nor desire to do, anything in particular during my permanence at the easel, other than simply witness and record the strangeness of what lies under the mound and the appropriateness of what thrives under rain and sunlight above it. I hope that through my mediating presence, the mound and the rest of the garden, both under and above each respective surface, might eventually become one. Beyond the considerations outlined above and many others which have not yet appeared in the full light of my consciousness, the undertaking of this 30-day journey also springs from my deeply held desire to offer to whoever or whatever in the garden might listen a sense of my most authentic self, which is nothing more than both stranger and beginner. My disinterest in the appearance of the carpet's surface stems from a belief that it's the experience of painting itself rather than its final appearance that contains meaning. I don't desire to engage in any speculative correlation, even if accidental, between the marks I've made and the visible world's momentary appearance. I'm bemused by the quaintness of this particular activity called painting, and by the art world really, and its place within the context of our human existence, though I find this bemusement strangely comforting. Eventually, some weeks later, after having repeated this ritual each day, I return to the world outside the garden with 30 paintings on carpet as evidence of this journey. I believe that through this journey, I've attempted to mindfully search for the exact moment when a certain kind of blindness might finally become sightedness. Consequently, these 30 paintings are an expression of being, not of doing. In that sense, the carpets are not paintings. The language they transmit is more like a reconfigured musical notations transcribed from a silent listening, and as such, it's just as substantively ephemeral. Consequently, the paintings are not hung on the wall in the gallery, but placed on sheet music stands, as if they're ready to guide the viewer's inner music rather than to be viewed, finally apprehended through the invisible antennas we carry within. These objects are not windows through which one may peer into a subjective world, but have been generated from under the earth or have somehow landed on the earth from far, far away. So others might still describe the carpet square as paintings, and I accept this status quo. I accept the word artist as a description of those who engage in many of the endeavours that have also intrigued and kept me occupied for as long as I can remember. But I've long considered that though that word might certainly describe certain aspects of how an artist functions, it doesn't and cannot describe what or who the artist is. The Latin root of the word artist describes one who professes a skill method or technique, so reducing the meaning of the word to a physical function akin eye-to-hand coordination, as a skill that can be learned, practiced, and then applied whenever necessary. Perhaps the application of a learned skill is what an artist might choose to do in order to maintain their practice. But can the application of a skill reveal what he or she is, reveal one's deepest motivation for continuing to persevere through the daily arising of numberless unanswerable questions in order to fashion a practice that might challenge the perceptual status quo? Through repeated consideration of the above, I concluded long ago that who I am, as well as what I do, because I think they're one and the same, might more actually be described as an apocalyptist rather than an artist. In ancient Greek, an apocalyptist is one who draws the veil back, the unveiler. I believe that this is what artist apocalyptists do. They draw the veil back on what already exists, what has always existed, but is concealed by the numberless layers of our habitual focus on the illusory visible world, preventing invisible substance from being seen or heard. The very first primal manifestation of this invisible substance, which existed even before light came into being, is sound. The Garden of Yes, just something about the title, refers to the last 7 words on the final page of James Joyce's masterwork novel, Ulysses. And they are, yes, I said, yes, I will, yes. Isn't that beautiful? And their collective opposition to the word no, which encompasses the spirit in which the Sky Garden was both initially conceived and through which it is being nurtured. And I'll just briefly describe the last project while that's going. It's called Songs for Albert. And it says in Italian, La mente di tutti è illuminata da canzoni d'amore, which mean everyone's mind is illuminated by love songs. So Italian, isn't it? Yeah, some people think that's a chef's hat just because I'm Italian. Since 2003, I've worked on a number of projects concerning the life and practice of Indigenous artist Albert Namatjira, who was born at Hermannsburg Lutheran Mission near Alice Springs on the 28th of July 1902. As a consequence of this research, this fascination, he was one of 7 artists I included in a project titled 7 Times Thank You, exhibited in Perth and Melbourne and at the Adelaide Biennale in 2006, in which I acknowledge and homage 7 deceased Australian artists as ongoing creative presences in my life. And his 1950 watercolour Ghost Gums was the work upon which my homage was titled, and it was called, was made and titled, was called Yellow Ectoplasm for AN. And this is the story that gave it its substance, a true story. So I first saw an Albert Namatjira painting in 1957 on the day my mother accompanied my sister and I to the headmaster's office to enrol us at Brighton Primary School. I was 10 years old. We just moved from our 2-room dwelling in the inner city behind a hairdressing salon to that seemingly faraway suburb so that we could enjoy the clean air and open spaces of what was then outer suburban Melbourne. As we walked through the primary school's corridor toward what was to be my 4th grade room, my mother stopped dead in her tracks and stared at a small frame print hanging on the wall. "Look," she exclaimed, "that's Australia." I looked up. The frame contained a dreamlike, colour-filled landscape whose skies above a red earth were filled with clear blue light. She read out the artist's name, which was handwritten on a small plaque attached to the frame. "The artist's name is Namatjira, Alberto Namatjira. He's Italian," she proudly told me. The pride with which my dear mother had pronounced the artist's name, misprinted with a G rather than with the correct J, and the Fra Angelico-like translucency of the colours in his painting confirmed in my young mind that he must indeed have been Italian. Giotto and Fra Angelico had been lovingly introduced to me only a year or so earlier by my 2nd grade teacher in Trieste, in Italy. So until I learnt otherwise much later in high school art classes, I firmly believed that Albert Namatjira had been an Italian artist who, like me, had migrated to Australia at an early age. Many decades later, my mother was shocked to learn of Namatjira's real identity and the true circumstances of his life and death. From that moment, she began to believe that his painted ghost gums contained something of the artist's presence. So much so that she was convinced they'd been named after him. I never attempted to dissuade her from her conviction because over time I also came to believe that Namatjira had been able to somehow transmute watercolour pigment into felt presence. It's strange that even when your mind knows something to be impossible, it can be swayed otherwise by the parts of your being that might be in touch with a dimension far more compelling than established phenomenological truths. These compelling other truths can at times instantly dissolve the seemingly indestructible conventions that hold together our agreed beliefs, revealing them to simply be fragile tumbleweeds dancing away from us towards an increasingly distant horizon, leading those of us courageous enough to follow to the transmutative land of unknowing. And if this is true, if we believe that Albert himself somehow becomes the work, then the light that emanates towards us from inside the mountains and from the centre of each tree, from each leaf and from all the space above and beyond the mountain ranges, constitutes all of the artist. And as this dancing light reaches us, we become horizon. So that's the story that gave birth to my intense connection to Albert. And as a result of this experience at Flinders University, I conceived of a performance titled 7 Songs for Albert. And I first presented it on the full moon of July 20, 2016, at the Newcastle Art Gallery as part of Black, White and Restive, a project curated by Una Ray examining the relationship between Indigenous artists and the white communities they operate in. Since then, Songs for Albert's been presented on full moon nights in many locations and contexts. And my text that night in Newcastle said this. It said that I had a residency at Flinders University, and during my residency I met some very old blackfellas who camped out with Albert. And they told me that he'd been a lover of American popular music of the 30s, 40s and 50s, especially the songs being interpreted by singers, musicians and composers such as Louis Armstrong, Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald, Irving Berlin, Etta James, Billy Eckstine, Nat Cole, goes on and on. He'd been a great lover of slow dancing as well, and a great exponent of that art, but he was never able to participate in social events because of the social segregation policies that prevented him from participating. The blackfellas always also told me with much humour that he somehow combined the movement of native animals with the dance steps of Fred Astaire. These popular ballads from the Latin word ballare, or love songs to dance to, embody the wistful and romantic musical space of a narrative poem, which Albert so enjoyed. The lyrics describe lived experience as the poetics of heart, while the accompanying melody underlines and supports the narratives of the song's emotion. The whole is then embodied by those moved enough to do so through the art of dance. To my mind, the lyrics of these ballads, written mostly by disenfranchised African Americans or by Eastern European migrants who'd fled from war-torn Europe in order to find redemption in the US, transcend both cultural specificity and time. In doing so, they propose an English language equivalent to the haiku, the ancient four-line poem form developed over many centuries by Japanese Zen poet monks in order to best describe both the paradox and the wonder of being human. In the presentation of these songs, the beat of the accompanying keyboard is slowed very considerably in order to better reveal the lyrics' poetics. And in so doing, the songs gradually become one seamless narrative, one continuous lyric, and one unbroken melody. And so I said in 2016, I said tonight, in order to commemorate the approaching 114th anniversary of Albert Namatjira's birth, I will present songs for Albert from the end of twilight until the rising of the waning moon. As we immerse ourselves in these songs, I invite you to join him on the dance floor so that together we may all celebrate both his work and his life. And in these performances, I usually create a space only for Albert and invite him to join us. That's it. Thank you. Now, I don't know if I'm running incredibly late, am I? I've spoken to Tanya before, and I said that I might sing one of Albert's favourite songs to you. Is that okay? You just have to hear his favourite song. No, blindfold, because I have to read the lyrics. Hello? Yes. We love each other so deeply that I ask you, the sweetheart, why should we quarrel ever? Why can't we be enough clever never to part? Every time we say goodbye, I die a little. Every time we say goodbye, I wonder why a little. Why the gods above me, who must be in the know, think so little of me. they allow you to go. When you're near, there's such an air of spring about it. I can hear a lark somewhere begin to sing about it. There's no love song finer. But how strange the change from major to minor. Every time we say goodbye, when you're near, there's such an air of spring about it. I can hear a lark somewhere begin to sing about it. There's no love song finer. But how very strange the change from major to minor. Every time, every time, every time we say goodbye. Just grab my stuff.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Domenico. I just did want to reiterate as well that Domenico will be playing piano for us again on Sunday, the 27th of October, a couple of nights from now, down at Little Cove, commencing as the sun sets for the evening of the new moon, and with the intent to play through until sunrise the next day. So please join us. Our next speaker is Christian Hagblom, an artist and photographer from Melbourne. Not that those things are mutually exclusive, sorry. I meant to say an artist and curator from Melbourne, and also the convener of the master's course at the Photographic Studies College. We have an exhibition on at Noosa Regional Gallery at the moment, which is kind of part of Floating Land, is kind of not. They bounce off one another, they relate to one another. Some of the artists overlap, and Christian might be, I think, the only artist in that exhibition that hasn't presented outside in the landscape as part of Floating Land. But I invited him to show a body of photographs that I've had my eye on for quite some time now, probably since he first started making them as an ongoing series. And they are really quite a significant documentation of an engagement with a particular landscape in Japan, which Christian's going to speak about, of course. But I did mention at the beginning of today's session that there are some presentations which have material in them that some people might find troubling, and that they're welcome to excuse themselves at any time that they find things difficult. We've all, of course, had a couple of presentations which deal with things from massacre sites and some quite terrible subject and content. Christian's presentation does deal with the issue of suicide, and I just want to remind people of the Lifeline number 13 11 14. But in particular, there's also a slide in here which depicts a body that is deceased. So if this sort of thing troubles you, then please feel free to excuse yourself from the presentation. Apart from that, I'd like to ask Christian to join us up on stage and tell us about his work.
Just take a second to get this ready. Okay, thank you very much, of course, to Michael, Tanya and the team at Noosa Regional Gallery for inviting me to be here, although very briefly, to talk about this project. But it is very exciting to show this work that I've been making for quite some time amongst such respected and wonderful speakers today. So I'd also, as everybody else has done, would like to pay respects to the traditional custodians of our land in past, present and future, and especially being here and speaking in this particular environment of which I'm not very familiar with. And although the work's made in Japan, it's still important to pay those respects. I should also say that I have to thank two Japanese assistants, Hatate Hiroshi-san and Nishikawa Ken-san, who are not here today but have heard me talk about this many times over. I should also, because there are a number of prestigious Japanese guests here, also acknowledge that, welcome them and acknowledge them. Yoroshiku onegaishimasu. Sorry, my Japanese is not good enough to do this presentation in full in Japanese. So I'm quite nervous about talking about this subject, as you can probably tell, but I think that's probably a good thing. And Domenico's never made me nervous, but after that phenomenal presentation, I can probably say that he has now. Okay, so this project is called Aokigahara Jukai, which translates as the Blue Sea of Foliage, or the Sea of Foliage, which is a forest at the northern foot of Mount Fuji, which is often referred to as Jukai, just as a shorter term as the forest, but it has lots of other names, and one of those is the Suicide Forest. So, as has been mentioned, it's always good to give a little bit of warning that there is a confrontational image in the presentation, and if anybody's uncomfortable or would like to have a chat with me afterwards, I'm more than happy to talk to you about that as well. I think it's also important to mention that suicide does affect us all, whether that's in a close or further distant relationship, but I think we all do have connections to this subject matter, and therefore it's important to talk about it. So most of my work is about or engages with landscape, whether that's land or urban scapes or whatever you want to call it. So this is a picture of central Tokyo, and I like to begin with this image because I graduated from studying photography in the late 90s, and then I decided I would like to go somewhere overseas, that a place where I could stay for a while and not be a tourist, where it's only just a few months. So I started looking into the possibilities of maybe doing a summer program in America, teaching English in South Korea, and then the opportunity of going to Japan and teaching English on a one-year working visa came up. So I definitely wasn't a Japanologist before moving to Japan, and I'm certainly not speaking on behalf of Japanese people here. It's purely my own perspective as a middle-aged white guy that wears flannelette shirts too much. So I thought it's a good idea to clear that up. So this is an image that I discovered and is being written about it in much more formal terms by Roland Barthes, and I'm not going to talk about Camera Lucida. This is from Signs of the Empire, a book that he, from his experiences in Japan. So this is basically the Emperor's Palace in the center of Tokyo. So when I first moved to Tokyo as a young photographer, excited to be in a new land, I thought the first thing that I want to do is photograph around the Emperor's Palace and look at the kind of urbanscapes and the different landscapes around this very ritualistic and important location. But as many of you may know, if you've been to Japan, or of course the Japanese people here, that there's not really anything to see at the Emperor's Palace, and you certainly can't get into the Emperor's Palace. So I was thinking about that idea and then reading Roland Barthes, and he talks about the Emperor's Palace as this empty center. It is, of course, very spiritual, but it's a place that we can't actually access. So while I was teaching English, one of the things that happens when you're teaching English is you try as much as possible to keep away from doing the, this is a pen, these are balloons, repeat after me, over and over and over. So luckily, I was so interested in photography, so I started to talk about photography with my students, and then it basically ended up just discussions around photography, really. My bosses weren't very happy, but all of my students would give me advice about where to take photographs, and of course, inevitably, most of those conversations revolved around Mount Fuji. So I was very interested in getting to Mount Fuji at some particular point and photographing, and I started to learn a lot of things about what was surrounding Mount Fuji, and there was often these strange, hushed discussions around, have you heard about the forest? I'm like, no, but I know there's a forest. And they're like, yeah, it's a strange place. We can't really talk about it. So I started to hear about Aokigahara Jukai through these kind of hushed conversations. And then I started doing my own research, and I guess this project is like a microcosm of a bigger project that documents the landscapes around Mount Fuji. So I think it's important to note this picture is taken at one of the 5 lakes that ring Mount Fuji, and it's basically this little holiday suburb that was built during the bubble. So there are all these amazing kind of Scandinavian homes there that are kind of just left abandoned with their boats and all their other things that we used for their leisure. The Jukai is on the north side of Mount Fuji, basically only a few kilometers away from the forest. There's the Defence Force training grounds. There's also, it's a town that's disappeared now, but there was the headquarters of the Om cult, who were responsible for the sarin gas attacks. So that's on the other side of the forest. There's Fuji-Q Highland, which apparently has the biggest roller coaster in the southern hemisphere. So when you're actually in Aokigahara Jukai, you can hear people screaming if it's a particular wind and direction from that roller coaster, which is a bit scary. And this is Gulliver's Travels, which was an unusual theme park that was actually next to the cult's headquarters, and so no one wanted to visit this place. So it was demolished, and I just happened to be there while Gulliver's hands were still intact. And then basically the town where the Om were making sarin gas and etc., that town's completely vanished. And in between all this is the forest called Aokigahara Jukai. And this is the entrance to the forest from the less popular end. So basically it's approximately 38 kilometers squared forest that is on the northern foot where centuries ago, I think 2 centuries ago, Mount Fuji blew out the side, not out the top. So there was lava that came out the side and formed this forest, which is made up of very fertile rock. So there's a lot of strange kind of stories about compasses don't work, so people take string into the forest. There's a lot of caves. So there's a lot of things mythological and but some that are more kind of urban myths, I guess. But also there are lots of other stories that are more formed and about reality. So there are 2 entrances. This is the less popular, and there's another entrance at the other side of the forest. And lots of people walk through here with an understanding of what takes place here outside of people going for picnics or mushroom picking or climbing Mount Fuji from one particular vantage point, and don't really pay attention to what happens outside or in the forest. So this is a long story, so I'm going to try and make it short, but basically I decided with a friend of mine and a girl who's now my wife that we would go to this forest and check out this myth and find out what this place was about. So basically we rented a car and we drove to Mount Fuji from Tokyo, which is an hour and a half, but we took our time. And during that journey, we came across a lot of very strange and mysterious things, which were kind of building. And I think, we've heard about this from some other speakers about landscape kind of starting to have this strange feeling or foreboding feeling or mythical feeling. So as we got closer to Tokyo, we stopped at a Shinto shrine, and in the grounds of the Shinto shrine, Mina found a BB gun, which looked remarkably like a real gun. And then there was this huge storm and really heavy rain, and there was a monk, and he asked us for a ride, and I've labelled him ever since the burping monk, because every 3 or 4 minutes he'd literally just belch, and he was telling us these wild stories, and in the end he actually wouldn't get out of our car, so we had to kind of just say, look, this is the station, we're going here. Anyway, that was very mysterious. And then we got to the forest, and there was a young man directing people, cars and traffic, because it was the Golden Week. Golden Week is like the Christmas holidays in Australia. So there's lots of people out and going to the countryside and going to the forest or Mount Fuji. So he was there directing people. And I had a quick chat with him at that stage. I couldn't really speak Japanese very well then, so I would speak with anyone who could speak English. And I asked him about the forest and why is there a souvenir shop here and what is that? And he told me that if you go in here and you follow this path, you'll find a hanging tree. And I was like, okay, this seems, these people, lots of people know about it and talk about it. So basically, as soon as we entered the forest, I had this very strong, intense, heavy feeling, and lots of people have asked me to describe that feeling, and I can't really put it into words, but I definitely had an immediate impact on all of us. So then it was a matter of, okay, this is really quite heavy and serious, and how can I uncover what's going on here? So we walked into the forest and we found a trail of BB bullets. This is 2 hours after Mina had found the BB gun, and then of course we saw the string that leads into the forest. So it was basically getting dark. So we thought it's definitely a good idea to get out of here, and we'll come back tomorrow. So I didn't make any photographs that day. So the next day I went in and made a few photographs, which I'll talk about as we look at them. But basically, within an hour, we'd walked about 500 meters off the actual walking track, and we discovered a body, a decomposing body, of which we really didn't know what to do. But we called the police, and that's also an interesting story, what happened there. So this all of a sudden became like a very serious reality, and as a young man, I was very confused and shocked at what I had seen, and I was looking for answers. So usually my projects are research driven, whereas I'll research as much as possible, then go to the place or meet the people with all of that information and make the work. Whereas this project was more about those 2 days and those experiences, and then doing the research to inform it the other way. So I'll just really quickly go through some references in visual culture to kind of outline this project. So this is a book on the left-hand side, which is called The Waves Tower by Seiichi Matsumoto from 1960. And this is a book that most historians or researchers claim to be what spurred the suicide phenomenon in the forest. So in the book, two lovers who are cheating on their partners meet at a particular station at a particular time, and the lady says towards the end that if I don't meet you here, I've gone to the forest at Mount Fuji and I will not return. And literally that's all that was said. There was no particular violence or no explanation as to how that would happen. And then because of the success of the book, Nakamura Nobuo made a film soon after in 1960 which made this story even bigger in pop culture and visual culture in Japan. And then I put these two in because I think it's also really important to talk about how this subject matter is mistreated and exploited. On the left-hand side is a film called The Suicide Manual by Fukutani Osamu, in which is completely horrific. I've sat through these films as, I don't want to see them again, but I have. And then there's the Suicide Circle, which was a very, very popular film by Sono Sion, which, he's a very important director. And I think by doing the research and looking through these films and seeing how, they're really kind of encouraging people to, who are concerned or have bad feelings or not sure what to do, to really, they're encouraging people to take their life. So this is another two films, visual culture references, The Sea of Trees Behind Mount Fuji, Takatomo Tomoyuki, which is actually quite a good film and talks about the seriousness and how we can approach these problems. And then there's the more recent film, The Sea of Trees, that should say Gus Van Sant, by Gus Van Sant, that was made in 2015, which some of you may know. And I think it's important to acknowledge that in Japan, getting help for issues around suicide, we've mentioned the phone number here a number of times today. If you read an article on the ABC website, there will be, if you are concerned about it, there's a contact number. We spoke earlier about the black dog, so we actually have names for these things to kind of speak about them amongst our peers and our friends. In Japan, there's a lack of support, and it's not spoken about in public as much as what it should be, I believe. And then there are shocking things like this, which is the Suicide Manual by Tsunari Wataru, which was published in '93, which very scarily rates suicide in terms of pain, attention, cost, etc., etc. So this book was made into one of those films and is now banned. But once you ban something, it kind of becomes more sought after. And then this is a film that was made by the American director Jason Zada in 2016, which is not a particularly good film. And it's interesting to note that they tried to make this in Aokigahara Jukai, but the government got wind of it and basically stopped them and said that it was illegal to shoot in the forest unless you had particular permits. And I won't go in it. You probably may have seen the vlogger, the YouTuber that was there a couple of years ago and discovered a body, and it was a live feed and it was seen by a lot of people and a lot of young people. So that's just a few examples of how it's been portrayed in visual culture. And interestingly as well, over the past couple of years, I've been given digital cameras to my friends, and I've asked them to photograph this mythical and iconic heart of Japan that's away from the center and the Emperor's Palace, because it's everywhere. It's in. So I just asked them to photograph every time they see Fuji. Just take a photograph. Just use the camera over a day. And these are some of the photographs that I've collected, and I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to do with these, but it's kind of like this extension of Fuji into the city, and it talks about how Mount Fuji draws people to it. And interestingly, people started making photographs of things that look like Mount Fuji as well. Okay, so I'm going to show you a draft of the book. Sorry, let's take a second. Okay, so it's not the best view, but I think it's important to mention that this project I am turning into a photo book. I have a slight obsession in the photo book, which most people know. about If You Know Me, and a large collection. So basically this is a draft of my photographs, some of which are in the gallery, but this is an early draft of the book in its layout. So this is a design that I've been working on with my Japanese colleagues and Perimeter Books in Melbourne. So this is an overview from level 5 at Mount Fuji, sorry, not level 5, about level 3 at Mount Fuji. You can drive to level 5 and then climb. So these images are newer images, and they're published in this book format as larger format images and shot where there's no objects or no particular perspective. So they're about giving some sense of the confusion of what it's like when you're actually in the forest. So the stories of getting lost, and I think they're exaggerated, but I have got lost in the forest once. You know, phones don't work. String can be helpful, but usually it's about keeping your bearings. So this is this is the first image I made in the forest when I first visited in 2000. So in between those two tourist spots, basically when you get to the middle, this is the entrance to the forest that goes off the track and into uncharted territory. And those two signs are quotes from the Bible that have been put there by people who have volunteered or probably done it illegally. And this is, I think, talking about 2000, so this is when string was everywhere, and it's not anymore because there's people who are employed to go and clean up basically eyesight, so that if you walk through there you don't see anything that may attract you into the forest. Whereas when I first visited, this was everywhere. This is a bouquet of flowers. This is a camera strap. And this gives you a bit of a sense, a detail of the makeup and the floor and the structure of the forest. It's very intense. There are a lot of caves, these amazing trees and roots. So this image talks about some of maybe the societal problems. These are ripped photographs of young homosexual men. And here we have some markings which are most likely made by the police who go into the forest a few times of the year to search for bodies. This was made in 2002, and yeah, this was another very eerie, strange experience. Someone had hacked this tree, but there was no other limbs or... So here I've very purposely made no people identifiable. So there are objects and other things that have names on them, but they're purposely left out of the project. This is this amazing amphitheatre which is on the other side. Again, one of those very scary occasions. Someone had chopped these trees into this particular size and covered a cave, and at the bottom of that, in the right-hand corner, there's Zippo lighter fluid. And this is a wallet. So I can't remember the exact year, but there was a Japanese film being produced in the forest, and they claim that the staff making the film found a wallet with about 300,000 yen in it, so about $3,000. And this kind of created this strange experience where people were going in there expecting to find dead people's wallets with money in them. So often these things that are left behind, often there's reoccurring artifacts that are, leaving these marks on the environment, and interestingly and environmentally, they're not being taken away. And through research, I've discovered that there's this huge kind of clash between local council and police, because if they find a body, they have to house it. The local council has to keep the body for a certain period of time. I believe it's 3 months, so that it could possibly be identified. So often if they have to, they'll take the body, and I experienced this and they'll leave the other things behind, and usually that's tea, things associated with music, maps, instructions, shavers, shoes, letters, photographs. So this is the body that I first discovered, and subsequently we called the police, and the police came, and quite remarkably, in Japan you have to have a foreign registration card or a passport at all times. The police didn't speak to me or my Australian friend. They basically just spoke to Minna and said, "Where is it?" They didn't ask us for any identification or anything, and they basically said, "Is it near here?" And we said yes. And then they just said, "All right, you guys go. We don't need you." So this is, some people go into the forest, and there's a Vice documentary that's quite interesting as well, and I think is handled quite well, not like those horror movies, about people who go into the forest thinking about this, and they take in a tent or a makeshift kind of lean-to, and they stay there for a bit of a time to think about and acclimatise, or, and to me this kind of alarm bells, like, if there's people there considering this, you must be able to go in and talk to those people to help them. And I have met one man who claims to live in the forest. So I know it's difficult subject matter, but beyond the shock and trying to figure out the cultural weighting and how this has taken place, and I understand historically and the myths, the forest has a very deep and important history, but in terms of suicide, that's more post-Second World War and from the 1960s pulp novel, but I think it's important subject matter to talk about these matters, and I know it's difficult, but so through hopefully publishing the photo book in the next couple of years, and being able to use that as a document outside of the gallery and the kind of, the white cube, and being able to use that to open up a conversation about this is very important. So that's all I have to say.
Thanks, Christian. A really difficult subject, of course, and a challenging body of work, but just because artworks are challenging and difficult doesn't mean that they shouldn't be made and shouldn't be discussed. So thanks for sharing that with us, Christian. Our final speaker today is Deborah Hart from Melbourne. Deborah is an arts-focused activist, writer, and also a founding director of Climart. Climart is responsible for producing the biennial arts event Art Plus Climate Equals Change in Melbourne, and we were very thankful that they agreed to have Noosa Regional Gallery as a satellite site for their festival this year. So hopefully that's a relationship that's going to continue on into the future. So please join me in welcoming Deborah to the lectern.
Hi, everybody. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional, the custodians. It's been incredibly moving to hear some of the presentations and the welcome. Being from Melbourne and I guess coming to a new part of Australia and seeing the way that these relationships are evolving and in such a it seems to me, beautiful way, has been really quite touching. I'd like to thank Michael and Tanya and Jennifer, the whole team. That's been fantastic to come. very humbling to listen to everybody's presentations and to have met a number of you, had some really enriching conversations. So it's actually really hard to get up and present because I just want to, stay absorbing it all. But anyway, it is a great privilege to be here. I'm really here on behalf of Bronwyn Johnson. She's the Executive Director of Climart, and because I was one of the founding board members, I guess that's my privilege to come and represent. But really, Climart is where it is because of Guy Abrahams and Bronwyn Johnson. They've really, really done an incredible job. And our job as board members has really just been to kind of come along to board meetings and say, wow, oh my God, that's fantastic. We're doing that. Paul, I might need your... Oh, I found it. Okay. So I thought, I am an activist. I'm a climate activist, and have been doing that really solidly since about 2005. So I thought one thing that I could bring to help all of us is to start to put things into context about how far we've actually come, because we're in a really reactionary place at the moment. And I think it's really interesting to kind of look back and remind ourselves of how we got to this very weird place. So I just put together a few photos and things from rallies. Some of you might have remembered that Kevin Rudd, the greatest moral challenge being climate change. That election, the Economist had named the first time that a government had lost because it failed to address climate change. So that was internationally reported. And it was pretty interesting to see all of the kind of actions that had led up to that. Remember, we'd had that kind of really, the millennial drought. There was a lot of fear, a lot of discussions. And you also started to have climate scientists receiving death threats. Did that happen up here? Were many of you aware of that? This is actually, I believe it's still the largest English language human sign ever made. It was penned by an 11-year-old girl. It was part of a local competition with school children to write a message for our government about climate change. So we were a little bit horrified because we all agreed it was absolutely the best message, but we needed a lot of people. So this is a sign that 5,000 people came to participate in, and it was driven by a local climate change group that started out as an email list. Basically, I started just annoying all my friends and sending them these emails and saying, oh, you've got to get involved. And the guy who then, we formed LIVE really together, which was Locals into Victoria's Environment. And it started by, and I'm telling you this because I want to encourage you, because it's just, things seem really kind of difficult, but when you look back, you think, wow, how did these sorts of things happen from just a small action? So basically, I went to my children's school, Fate, and took a card table and, had pamphlets from, the Australian Conservation Foundation and Greenpeace, and was trying to start conversations. And the guy opposite me was, he had a stall for the Sea Scouts. And so at some stage, I kind of wandered over and said, I'll sign your thing if you'll sign mine. And we got into a great conversation. He said, do you have a website? And I'm like, are you kidding? I've only got 10 signatures on my thing. Well, he offered to build a website. So that's David Robinson. He's now, he's still the convener of LIVE, and LIVE is a very, very active group. And in fact, tomorrow on behalf of LIVE, I'm meeting the Zero Emissions NUSA group to talk about community-driven renewable energy projects. So that's pretty cool. We also have a really, really brilliant board of very dedicated people who bring very different skills. So you probably remember COP15 in Copenhagen. Do you remember that there were huge marches, just hundreds of thousands of people were taking to the streets. There was such a strong activist presence in Copenhagen that it really unsettled the delegates, and they locked out civil society about halfway through the conference. So, and left the fossil fuel industry in charge. You might remember there was that Danish text. It was basically a very, very disturbing response. So just prior to that, I guess to remember the whole context, we'd seen the hacking of the East Anglia University climate scientists. Do you remember that? It was dubbed ClimateGate. Of course, nothing was ever found. Timing, of course, was perfect. There were, again, large numbers of reports of scientists being harassed, death threats, threats of sexual violence for females. Really pretty creepy. And you were hearing, certainly in the mass media, you were getting a lot of reporting about ClimateGate and what might have happened in these emails, but not a whole lot of discussion around why climate scientists were receiving death threats for reporting science, facts. So, and the other thing to remember too is that it had just come after the global financial crisis, where about the amount of money that could have transitioned the entire global energy systems had been handed to the people who had gambled with other people's savings, to the degree that they'd actually crashed, largely crashed without bank bailouts, it would have crashed the global financial system. Not only had they gotten away with it, they actually paid themselves bonuses. So the Occupy movement, do you remember, there was a lot of movement around that. There was a lot of excitement and energy from a lot of really well-intentioned, hardworking, caring people. And it was a very interesting and messy space. I don't know, did you have much of it up here and around Brisbane? Or? Yeah. See, these people, we're all still here. It's just that, we've also have busy lives. So this is Lord Monckton. You've probably heard of Lord Monckton? Yeah. Okay, so he is a climate denier, celebrity, that's probably the best word. So do you remember when he was coming to Australia? He toured a number of times. So he started coming in 2010, he came again in 2011, this was 2013 obviously, but kind of interesting, why would Australia be being targeted by the climate skeptic celebrities of the world? Anyway, it was all weird too, because the way it was being so reported, he was treated like a media superstar. But when we did get wind of it, and this is actually one of Climate Act's group, this is another group that I'm involved with, and we do theatrical, performative work, where basically we're just nuisances. We find out about a politician or, somebody like Lord Monckton, and we show up in a particular set of characters to confront them in a funny way. We showed up and we were like his greatest fans, and we were saying how, we were just so excited. We'd waited, centuries to find somebody who shared our views of the world, and he actually was quite a good sport too, because he had no choice. His people were arriving and we were welcoming them all and saying, I'm Lord, Carbonaceous, and I'm, Professor Gaseous, and, welcome to the Flat Earth Institute with your host, Lord Monckton. And he came out and we were just telling him how much we adored him. We'd waited centuries to find somebody who agreed with us. And anyway, it was somewhere in the middle of nowhere, and there were about a dozen people there. So this idea that he was getting so much media attention, interviews, and, News Corp, they splashed him everywhere, but he was even interviewed on the ABC, and yet when you actually went to one of his presentations, seriously, it was it makes this room look busy. So Anyway, so that was kind of fun. I just wanted to, I put that slide in just because I thought, yeah, like why was somebody like Lord Monckton getting all this attention? This was another example of the way things that were being reported. So, okay, you know, we had scientists in, I think it was in Canberra, they actually had to be moved. Does anybody remember that? They actually had to be, their offices had to be moved because they were receiving so many death threats. They actually feared for our leading climate scientists. So what does that tell you? So that time was when we, you know, remember we had Kevin Rudd, remember they had the carbon pollution scheme, which was, it was basically a real lie. Like it actually would have paid polluters with taxpayers' money and would have pretty much locked in a system where we wouldn't reduce emissions in this country until around 2030, 2035, because it relied on dodgy offshore carbon permits. So then we had Graham Wood. Now, that's really important because he's from Queensland. Remember him, Graham Wood, with the what if? Okay, Graham Wood. So I really want to run through this because to me, I think it's important to remember that it's just what people do. What people in communities do can have huge impacts. So Graham Wood, he built the What If, his What If business, which was, you know, he's a very, very wealthy person, in his garage in Queensland. I think it was in Brisbane. So he had donated a lot of money to environmental causes, to the arts. He's a very enlightened person. He started a foundation. He called up Bob Brown just before the 2010 election and said, it's really interesting how you guys, you know, there's a number of seats around the country where you are leading until the last 2 weeks before the election. And that's when the two major parties start slamming with huge budgets, the advertising. Your messages just get forgotten. So if you let me design a campaign for you, but you just have to let me run the whole thing, I'll get you the balance of power. And Bob Brown said, okay. And he did. Like, he's a pretty smart person. He's really good with, obviously, with computers and things. Anyway, so he did. He worked out not just exactly where those marginal seats were, but how much it would cost to get the advertising at the right time to swing those people who really did support Greens policies around justice, fairness. I mean, the Greens had, at the time, I remember sort of researching this, they had about 45 serious policies. It's just that they never, you know, they don't have the budgets to get them out there because they never had those kind of donations. I believe it's still the largest single donation to a political party that we're aware of because the Greens, they disclose. Anyway, so that's how we ended up in 2010 with a situation where between Tony Abbott and Julia Gillard, they actually had to sit down. They had to convince a number of kind of MPs to vote with them. So apparently Julia Gillard was very fair-minded in the negotiations, and she was more trusted because she always deferred to the department heads before she made any agreements for their loyalty. So you ended up with this really interesting situation where you had the Greens and you had independents, and that's when we had a condition for the Greens support was the Multi-Party Climate Change Committee. So sorry I have to have a history lesson in climate policies, but we've done it. So the Multi-Party Climate Change Committee, over a number of months, and this was actually in that time. Sorry, did I just turn it off? I think I just turned it off. What have I done? Oh. Yeah, so it was this time that was happening. So, and in fact, it was Tony Windsor, he also got a death threat. So it wasn't just the climate scientists, even people on the Multi-Party Climate Change Committee were being seriously hassled. So that was organised in less than a week. And there were, I think, between 8,000 and 10,000 people showed up to that rally to support the price on carbon, because you basically started to have the whole of the carbon legislation being drawn up, which became the Clean Energy Future legislation. So 8,000, 8 to 10,000 people showed up. It was Labor Day weekend with less than a week's notice. The coalition organised, they bussed in people to Gillard's office on the other side of town, and they had about 200 people, but they were reported in about the same way. So the reports show, it was obviously like somebody was standing behind the camera person and going, you know, so that it looked all jostly and busy, but basically this rally or protest of bussed-in people in front of Julia Gillard's office got about the same coverage. So, yeah, it's been a really interesting time. So, and then what you had, so with the Clean Energy Future legislation, you had like 18 bills. They had to listen to experts from all areas, so not just climate scientists, they had economists, they had a whole lot of measures around how taxation could work. It was a really very sophisticated suite of laws. And if anybody wants some information later, I can send you some things, because I've written quite a bit with it. I have written a book, and it's used in schools, but this was, you know, it's published by Allen and Unwin. I think that they were just like, this layer of, you know, politics was too much for the actual age group. But it's such a fascinating history. So it was very, very thoughtful, careful legislation, and it actually, I've been told from a number of sources that it was the most progressive climate legislation or environmental suite of laws in the world at the time, like from where we had come from in particular. So for 2 years, so from basically July 2012 to July 2014, not only was Australia leading with the most progressive suite of climate action laws in the world, but they were really, really working. So we had emissions coming down, we had tens of thousands of new jobs in the clean energy sector being created. We had hundreds of millions of dollars of new investments, and because of the way renewable energy and you know, storage and distribution systems work, these were jobs in regional economies, local economies. So what's there not to love? You know, why would a prime minister come in to kill a set of laws that was doing so much good? Anyway, so this is another act. These are the Climate Guardian Angels. This is Climate Acts, the other group that had the medieval astronomers. So we basically went up to be there when the Abbott government came in, and because his first act of business was to rescind our climate laws. And I should just say too about that, the angel imagery, it was actually Alana Beltran. Has anybody seen the Weld Angel from the Styx Valley? So she inspired this imagery, and she and I helped create some of the costumes. Liz kind of created those original ones. It's a whole collective for a few of us. But so this leads into, I'll talk about how now our major festival, so Climate Arts Festival, came about. So you can sort of see we were going through this really interesting, weird time. In Victoria, we had a government that was very hostile to environmental and social justice issues, and nobody wanted to talk with us. So when we started in 2010, winter of 2010, Fiona Armstrong and myself, we basically took Guy Abrahams out for a coffee and said, Guy, we think that you should do this thing and you'd be really great at it. and have this alliance, and we can just get like-minded people. And Guy was like, oh, all right, look, let's give it a crack if you help. Now, Fiona Armstrong, she is the founder of the Climate and Health Alliance, which is an amazing organisation. So we already knew that the model worked, and then Guy being does any of you know Guy? He's just awesome. So he's very well loved, he's very well respected, has a very long history in the arts. He managed his mother's gallery, Christine Abraham's gallery, for a long time since a young man, but he was a trained lawyer. So really, really cool. We just couldn't have had a better set of skills. And then when Bronwyn Johnson came on board, we started to develop some ambitious programs for really addressing the community. And the festival was one of the first. We'd had some public forums which were really well attended, like as part of the Sustainable Living Festival, but certainly the Art plus Climate equals Change really changed things for us. And suddenly we were actually quite overwhelmed with international attention and things. It was just, again, one of those things that suddenly it resonated with a lot of people. It gave a lot of people a sense of, I guess, a place to connect, to hear more about other artists and other creative people who cared as much as they did. Paul, can I control this, or will you start the... Just... Awesome, thanks. So this is this was the first festival, and here's a collection of images. So that festival featured 25 curated exhibitions, keynote lectures, forums. We had bike tours, we had architecture tours, and at its core, its key question was asking, how do we unleash the power of the arts to engage people in the most important conversation in human history? So it was big, and really, again, thanks to Bronwyn and Guy, it was really, really successful. And on the back of that too, we were invited to present a work at the UN in New York. So this is Debbie Simon's work, Counting 1 to 4 Nature Mort. So that was shown in New York in September, and then it was included as part of the COP21 festival, Art COP21 in Paris in December. So then let's move on. That's Climate Guardians. We were there as well as another group, another of our acts called the Coal Diggers, the Billionaire Miners. So we did quite a bit of work there as well. Again, all performative, and we were quite shocked. We ended up on front covers of newspapers all over the world and being interviewed by, live on news stations. It was actually pretty overwhelming. You may recall Paris had the horrific terrorist attacks, and it was really a city under siege, and it was very moving to be there. we just felt determined that we had to go and we had to defy the state of emergency. We understood why they were taking special measures. They were determined to get an agreement, and they had to create a space that was safe for countries to send all of their delegates. But yeah, it was illegal to be more than one person on the street. That was considered a group. And yeah, there were curfews. It was really heavy. There were riot police. It really was a very tense time. That is Place de la République. Place de la République. That became the people's shrine for all of those who lost their lives in terrorist attacks. And in front of that, AVAS organised all of these shoes. There were thousands and thousands of pairs of shoes. It was an incredible sort of installation. And Pope Francis even sent a pair of shoes. I remember that. So that was a really beautiful image. And that was on the Sunday before the conference started, on the Monday, the following day. And Parisians, they created a human chain leading all the way down from Place de la République down to the Bastille, and that went past the Bataclan, which is where the largest of the terrorist attacks had happened. We had people, over that week, we had people coming up to us in the street and hugging us and thanking us for coming. Often they had seen our images on television or they'd heard about it on the radio. And that was really moving because you got, again, that sense of it is about people and it's about communities. And, you know, one time I remember getting off the metro and a woman's just started crying and hugging us all. It was really, you know, and you just thought, well, if that's the only thing we've done, we've really helped. We've really helped some people feel that they weren't sort of abandoned in this, you know, really difficult time. That was an amazing installation. That they were literally from a glacier, and over the time of COP21, they were melting. And can I say too, they were melting quite quickly because it was warmer than usual. Later on, I'll show you another slide actually that reminds me about that. But yeah, that was, the arts program as part of it was brilliant. And again, because the French, they really value arts and they value culture, and they're not afraid of having philosophical conversations. So shortly after, that was April 2016, we embarked on a poster project where we had 10 artists who were basically just given the brief of, you know, address climate change. Let's put them up as rock posters. We're going to mass produce them. We're going to put them around and see, you know, start some conversations. So this is John Campbell's work. That was really sublime. This was Gabrielle de Vitry and Will Foster's work. This one related to the Hazelwood plant. I don't know if you know, it's like, full disclosure, my father actually, when he worked for the SEC, did the designs for the Boilermaker. So, I've come from a fossil fuel background. But Hazelwood was due to shut in stages between 1999 and 2005, but the Conservative government basically sold it. It was really being thrashed, regarded as the most polluting plant in the world, and we had the Hazelwood mine fire because the company had, in cost cutting, had basically removed so many of the safety measures. So this was really, really controversial. and it was also sponsored by the City of Melbourne. So we suddenly had this situation where we'd been really attacked in the News Limited, News Corp journals, which was great. It provided us a wonderful opportunity to allow those arguments to run. But the plant shut the following year. And this is that image I was talking about. Engie, the owner of Hazelwood had been GDF Suez, changed its name to Engie. Engie was a major sponsor of COP21. That's kind of gross, right? So this was the company that owned the Hazelwood when the mine fire happened. We're talking 45 days, the whole Latrobe Valley covered, blanketed in carbon monoxide, mercury. It was really, really a big thing in Victoria. And an independent inquiry found that 11 people had died as a direct result of negligence by the company. So when we were in Paris, this was probably, in my view, the best thing we did. We blockaded Engie for 5.5 hours. And when I said that it was unusually warm that December, except for this day, it was freezing. And the way the towers work, you had this tunnel of freezing wind. But anyway, you can see the riot police eventually came in the end. This was at the very end, but we were holding them to account because they were spending several times more money on lobbying to reduce emission reduction target ambitions in the kind of, halls in COP21, whilst they owed the CFA, the firefighters, $19 million. They were out of pocket. So this is a voluntary firefighting group, was out of pocket by $19 million. And not only had Engie caused this fire, they weren't even paying back the out-of-pocket costs for the Voluntary Fire Association. So we were very careful in our discussions with the Latrobe Valley, but we really wanted to represent them and we really wanted to speak on their behalf. So we actually didn't discuss climate change at all, except to say that why are you spending 10 times the amount of money on lobbying to reduce action on climate change when you owe this community? So yeah, that was really great to me. Now, I think I just press again. This was the next festival. So this was the following year, our second Art Plus Climate Equals Change Festival. Yeah, so that one featured, let me just get the figure right. More than 30 curated exhibitions. Exit was its main kind of feature. It was basically, I'll see if I can Ted Baraclough's work was in it, and his work was part of your show, wasn't it? It's gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. Loved it. Here's some further images. This is Exit. This was actually shown in Paris during COP21, and this was an amazing, really, really amazing work, and I would encourage you to look further into it. But it brought together just so much information from scientists, and then artists, and it was information that you literally just absorbed. Migration, weather patterns, population, but it was fascinating, and it proved very, very popular with school groups, universities, and as well as the general public. So it really served quite a few purposes, and it was a really great way to bring that whole science and creative kind of communications together. So that festival was nominated. It was one of 3 that was nominated for the inaugural Leading Culture Destination Climate Smart Award by the City of London. And again, I have to stress that, we've just been a vehicle for so many artists and so many institutions, so many art galleries, so many groups. So it's really such a testament to what collaborative, creative action can be. So this brings us to this year, which, has just recently finished. It grew again, so this year there were 33 galleries and museums, 174 artists. We had an audience estimated at 469,000 people, which was really exciting. 153 public programs featuring contributions from 205 presenters. So that, including an incredible one focused on in the Indigenous community at the Living Pavilion at the University of Melbourne. So I'll just run this one. So one of the best things about this last festival was the opportunity to further enrich our relationships with the Latrobe Valley community, because in Victoria, that is our community that is on the front line of the transitions with the economy. So these transitions are inevitable and they're really exciting, and as we know, there's so many opportunities. We have so much advanced technology and science and understandings. We really could transition and it would be really great for everyone. But they're not the messages that the most vulnerable communities are getting. They're being targeted with propaganda by, those people who are heavily invested in an ecocidal and genocidal industries. So this was an incredible collaboration between the Latrobe Regional Gallery and Climb Art, and basically it was a commission made possible by Bank Australia, and Mandy Martin, Alexander Boynes and Tristan Parr. So they created this installation. It was called Rewriting the Score, and it was really moving. And you may recall that I mentioned Fiona Armstrong, one of the founders who had also founded the Climate and Health Alliance. She was just up there on her own watching it and sitting next to a woman who had started to cry. And Fiona's a nurse, so when it finished, she just asked this woman if she was okay, if there was anything that she could do for her. And the woman started to describe what had happened during the Hazelwood mine fire. One of the victims had been a close family friend. She just talked about how she'd never come to the gallery ever, but had been told that this would be really interesting. She'd grown up there all her life, so this was the first time she'd gone to their gallery. It's communities gallery. And then Fiona kind of confessed that she was part of the group that had brought it, and the woman just hugged her and said, you know, she was just so moved by it. And they watched it through again, and they chatted for another half an hour. And it's just, again, it's one of these stories, like so many of the stories that have come out by the different artists today, that the arts can just cut through, can get under the guard, and can actually create meaningful transitions and meaningful experiences for people. This was, sadly I wasn't there because we had so many things on, and I couldn't, I had to be at one in St Kilda. As the board, we would often just divide things to make sure that somebody was there. But this was just meant to be absolutely beautiful. Bronwyn Johnson was there, and she's just raved about it ever since. And Katie apparently at the end of it said that the best things that the community could do to help in the local Indigenous people would be to adopt an Indigenous animal. So I want to look a lot more into that, but that just was, apparently stunning. So, again, RMAT, this show was really interesting and brought guest artists from internationally as well. Dombrowski's journey into the wild was stunning. Sarah McConnell, she's actually a long-time activist, and she's been a volunteer with Climb Art, and it was a real shock when we discovered that she created this beautiful art as well. So we actually had to encourage her to come into the exhibitions, to actually bring her show in, but just gorgeous work. Rebecca Mayo, they had a brilliant tour too, walking around the streets, kind of looking at how much waste there is. This was, just gorgeous. So the poster project for this year, that ran alongside as well. So that was rolling out around about the same time as Climb Arts Festival was opening. The poster project, which was part of it, these posters were then appearing on the streets. So it seemed like a really good way to, I guess, be promoting not just our festival, but some of the work and starting to bring forward some of the conversations that the posters have encouraged. So, I just want to finish, I guess, just running through some of the experiences of being an activist that uses performance and uses creative, I guess, tactics. I mentioned the Coal Diggers, that's Coral Bleach, and Josh Frydenberg. He's then he was our environment minister. He was having a big fundraising breakfast. So it's really awkward when Coral Bleach shows up to welcome him and welcomes all of his guests and says things like, "Oh, darling, it's so exciting. We're sitting next to each other." And, they really, really, they can't help laughing. Even the police, after we finished, and because that is actually me, I got all my costumes and everything. I put them all in my trolley, and I waved to the police and said, "See you guys," and they've waved back and said, "Bye, Coral." So it was like, so you can't get wrong, and you just the police don't usually stop us because they do know us by now. I was trying to give some officers a coal intestine dysfunction vaccination recently, which is just basically a $sign with a coal thing on your forehead, so that you don't get infected by those nasty greenie ideas. Anyway, and the cops just were laughing, saying, "Look, thanks, Coral, but we can't accept." and went into the, because, anyway, so yeah, you can get away with a lot more, and they tend to not stop you because they're enjoying the show. So we've occupied all sorts of offices, and, when the police come and you say, oh, thank you so much for dropping everything to look after us, because we're so rich and important, they tend to not get as cross. This is an absolutely brilliant project that I just want. It's got nothing to do with Climart except that we work with them, and we madly support what they're doing. This is basically, as you can see, it's a map of gratitude. It is a very carefully researched map of all of the relationships between the fossil fuel industry and their financiers and the arts. So I'd really encourage you to have a look. It just goes to show you that the arts, in the ways in which the arts have become kind of like the marketing arm of the fossil fuel industry. There's actually another couple of Queenslanders who've written the book Game of Mates. Has anybody read The Game of Mates or know about it? Get your hands on it. It's fantastic. There is a chapter on mining, but it's written by some academics from Queensland University, and it just basically reveals how the game of mates, the ways in which these vested interests have completely captured our decision makers, and it's costing, because they're kind of hardcore economists, they've run all the numbers, it's costing you more than half of your savings, more than half of the money that you would earn on your average kind of working career is actually going into their pockets. So this, I wanted to show you this one. We do a lot of actions, but I'm just showing you a few because this one was the National Gallery of Victoria. We carefully timed it because we wanted to, get a beautiful dusk action at the same time as people were coming into the theatres, which are right next door, if any of you know Melbourne, so at the Victorian Arts Centre. And we had collected a whole lot of rubbish, a whole lot of plastic out of the Yarra, and we had a couple of kind of faceless villains dump it into the NGV's moat, and then the angels were clearing it up. And just by accident, it happened to be the night that a high-level collectors' dinner and board was inside, which was very exciting because the key target was Hugh Morgan, who's the president of the NGV's foundation, and he's actually Australia's kind of leading denier. He's seeded the Lavoisier Group, the Institute of Public Affairs. He's just a dangerous person. So, and then when the police had come, one of the officers had actually seen one of our stencils that morning for the first time, and we'd done that stencil in 2013, so that was kind of cool too. But that was a really beautiful action, and we had people coming out from the NGV and, saying, oh my God, they're freaking out in there, this is amazing, and taking photos, and it was just like, great, because we just really intended to get it out there on social media. We hadn't intended to actually, kind of blockade them inside. This was a production that we put on to raise a little bit of money, digging deeper, secrets of the neo-colonial movement unearthed. We actually really thought that we would be saying goodbye to this act. We thought, we would have a progressive government get in, and there would be no point in having the billionaire coal diggers running around, saying it's so mean, people trying to tax us and things, But sadly, we haven't been able to retire them. And this is what we're currently running with. We have been visiting the Herald and Weekly Times headquarters in Victoria now. We started a couple of weeks before the election was announced, and as expected, it was appalling, the coverage. You probably are aware that all of your newspapers are owned by News Corp, yeah? all of the newspapers in Queensland are owned by News Corp. More than 70% of Australia's media is owned by Murdoch. So this is a company that, you know, you remember the hacking scandal in the UK. I mean, this is a company with these are like court documents, endemic criminality. It is a lawless culture. And they are actively targeting areas where these industries, are losing ground, and particularly in Queensland. I mean, they would like to turn all of Australia into a giant quarry, I think, but, you know, you guys are particularly at risk at the moment, and particularly because you don't have an upper house. So your democracy is more vulnerable than anywhere else in the country. But yeah, we really tracked the way that the election was covered, and we have some plans to put in a submission through the Australian Press Council, and we're timing that with a court appearance of myself and another angel. We were arrested doing one of these acts. I was just taking the photos. She was there with her little 5-year-old boy named Arlo. It was the 5th time we'd done it, and on 3 previous occasions the police had come and they'd actually congratulated us for it because it's completely silent. Thousands and thousands of people work in their office, but they've only got the 2 floors. And so nearly everybody walking past would say, "Oh, this is really gorgeous, thank you so much. You've got no idea how many people in this building, you know, support you. Welcome back." I mean, it's roughly every week that we've been doing it. And we just happened to get a nasty cop. The charges are weird. We probably won't go through, but it also provides us with a really good opportunity to time it and build a bit on the fact that we were arrested for being silent and just holding a message. So, and the police were really creepy too. They were like, "You're so manipulative, like this poor child," and you know, and we're like, where else is he going to go? He's too little to go to school. Like he's with his parents, you know, and telling me that I'd brainwashed my, you know, really dedicated climate activist friend. I'm like, I think she's a grown up. I think she knows what she's doing. And, you know, it was all very weird. So, and now finally, I'm pretty sure this is my last slide. Yes, it is. How exciting. Oh my God. It's just so brilliant. Yeah, like, oh. So, you know, I guess I really wanted to finish by saying how incredibly motivated I have felt today. I trembled through some of those presentations and felt, just incredibly inspired by what goes on in communities. You know, as just a glance through history shows, people in power, for whatever reasons, they just seem to want to abuse it. And, you know, it's only the community, like we're another branch of government. We still have a democracy. So getting out there, getting into the communities and having the sort of conversations that you guys as artists and creators have, it's everything now. I'd love to see those caravans, and some of you artists like do it in kind of take it in turns, and I'd love to just come and be a fly on the wall. But, you know, go out there into some of these vulnerable communities where people are being lied to and frightened. They're communities that are really going to be in more and more and more trouble. They're not only on the front line of climate change, but, you know, these are resource wars we're seeing now. So, thank you very much for indulging me. I hope the history wasn't too heavy, but I think it's important to remember that we had the best climate laws in the world. And we got them because we had a model of democracy, that multi-party climate change committee that sat down, listened to the experts, and they brought in brilliant laws, perfectly crafted. Those laws ensured that the low-income earners were actually supported through the transitions. They included funding for retraining, retransitioning those affected communities. So we just have to kind of pull them back out and start the revolution. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deborah. I think what I take away from that last presentation in particular is the ability that the arts have to actually cut through sometimes, particularly when it can feel like you're seeing the same message over and over from different sides in the media, whereas the arts can really shift the way that you perceive that message, I suppose, and make you take account of it. But also the fact that, it's those small conversations that the arts can generate and those personal interactions which can be really powerful, and those things snowball throughout a community as well. So I think that's a message which can be taken home from many of the presentations that we've had today. And the way that communities really do matter, just to echo Deborah's words there at the end. I think we've got probably about 5 or 10 minutes for a couple of questions if anyone had anything that they'd like to ask of any of the speakers today. I think we've still got a handful of the speakers left here, and we've got a couple of roving microphones as well. So has anyone got something that they'd like to ask? I've got someone.
My question's for Deborah. After all of the enthusiasm and the energy that you've invested at this point, how do you maintain that momentum and that energy? Because I don't know, I speak for a few of my friends and some of my family members. We're really exhausted by fighting this one. And as you say, there's so much power at the top. How do we keep rolling this message out and actually have it heard and get a result, which we so desperately need?
Yeah, and that was such a good way to frame it, because we all do have, I have just complete, existential crises regularly. But then I'll come to something like this, thank you again, everyone, and just think, oh my God, there's so many brilliant people. And then the reason why we're targeting News Corp is because that is the mouthpiece. And it's like a retail outlet, because actually this whole system, as we know, it's eating itself. They have no legitimacy. Their only way of responding to Greta is to be so nasty and attack her, do everything except engage on the one question she's really asking is, why aren't you listening to the scientists? So I think we just have to remind ourselves that this is reactionary. That's why I wanted to go through that history. We are Australia. Australia is actually the place to have the showdown between these old patriarchal, imperialist, capitalist, colonialist, hideous mindset and the renewable, the local, it's like you've got creative, collaborative, and you've got exploitative, extractive. And it just seems like Australia's kind of a mecca for both. We are still a democracy. We have some amazing people. We have incredible history with the Indigenous people who, if we took our scientists, our Indigenous communities, and all the understandings around soil regeneration that's happening now, we could change things so quickly. And that's what's the threat. So the scientists were being attacked. The activists, now we're seeing the whistleblowers, journalists. Journalists and, whistleblowers are facing lengthy prison centres for reporting facts. So that's not a paradigm that can last long. So I hope that helps. Just remind ourselves that they're just full of crap and they're threatened. So.
Anyone else got any questions for any of the artists?
We are just looking around the room. We still do have most of the artists here, I think. If there were any further questions, we've probably got time for one more, perhaps. It's been a massive day, actually, and a number of you have been here since 7:15 this morning, so thank you for persevering. I did just want to finish up by thanking everyone again, particularly the presenters today. I'm going to read off the list to make sure I don't forget anyone. Jandamara Cad, of course, speaking about the Brooke Andrews Travelling Colony and the community participation in that Bianca Beetson and her collaboration with Leah Barclay about Indelible Stain, and one of the most kind of passionate and honest reactions to the Murdering Creek site that I've been able to witness since I've been here. Leah Barclay's amazing presentation about the river listening project and the way that science and art have been married so poetically in that project. I'm looking forward to seeing that again in the next Floating Land. Masao Akabe and Chihiro Minato, thank you so much for revisiting us, Masao, and Chihiro for being a mode of communication for us as well. It's been really great, and we've seen some really great outcomes, particularly the collaboration yesterday out at the site of the fires with the Coolum Fire Brigade Chief. That was quite amazing. Domenico De Clario, thank you, Dom. Once again, a pleasure to listen to you perform. And, as I said, we had the great experience of witnessing Dom perform out at Boreen Point early on in Floating Land. And there's the opportunity again this Sunday evening at Little Cove. I know Dom speaks about it more as a collaboration with the environment as opposed to a solitary performance. And I think that's a way that we can really think about most of the presentations, most of the outcomes, most of the projects that happen throughout all of Floating Land. I think it sets us aside from perhaps other events like Sculpture by the Sea and other outdoor art events. I think all of the artists are really collaborating with the environment and reacting to the environments where their work's situated. Christian Hagblom, thanks Christian for really tackling a really confronting and difficult topic with your project and having the bravery and the fortitude to discuss it in this public forum. And Deborah, of course, that was a really great reminder of the amazing work that artists do more broadly to confront important climate issues. Once again, I'd just like to reiterate that it felt like a real privilege that Noosa Regional Gallery got to become part of Art Plus Climate Equals Change this year, and we're looking forward to it again, hopefully in 2021. Hopefully it's the start of a global push for the festival. Global will start national, but a global push would be great as well. And thank you all for attending today. It shows that this community is really passionate about the arts and the environment, and it's great to see such a strong turnout. I think the bar is just about open out the back there. The J's open the bar for about an hour, so there's a chance for everyone to get together, have a couple of informal conversations, and probably a well-deserved glass of wine. So thank you all for attending today.